So continuing from where we left off, we were looking at the rectangle and shape classes for inheritance, and we saw this issue that we ran into because we have a constructor for rectangle and a constructor for shape. And so when I tried to compile this program, we noticed this error that it was giving us because of the fact that we are giving it the wrong kinds of arguments to the shape constructor. And the reason for that, as I mentioned in the previous video, is because of the fact that whenever we want to construct a rectangle, that also involves calling the constructor for the shape class. So what happens now is if we have both a constructor for rectangle and a constructor for shape, anytime that we, say, come into this demo right here, we call this constructor for rectangle, that's also going to require calling the constructor for shape. So when we do this, because we haven't explicitly created a line right here, what it's trying to do is effectively call the default constructor for shape. But as we've mentioned in our introduction to classes overall, we noted that if we've provided an explicit, our own custom constructor, we can no longer rely on calling the default constructor for a particular class. So instead, we need to include an explicit call to shape right here inside of this rectangle constructor. So we've seen something like this before, where we were using the this keyword in order to call one constructor of a class from inside of another. Well, we can do something very similar right here, where instead of using the this keyword, we're going to make use out of the super keyword. So we're going to use the word super, and then we have that pair of parentheses to call it. And what this is going to do, when we specify it like this, inside of a constructor method, using super like this is going to call the equivalent constructor for the parent class. So we just have to make sure that the arguments that we pass into this match up with the arguments for some particular constructor inside of this parent class. In this case, we're going to be using a single double to specify this exact constructor right here. But if we introduce multiple other constructors, as long as we gave them different method signatures, then the types of arguments that we pass into here would determine which one of those constructors that we would end up calling. Okay, so right here what I need to go ahead and do is just pass in some value. And so what I can go ahead and do, really convenient thing, is to just add an additional parameter here. So I'm going to say something like our length and our width, and I'll also go ahead and add something like the apothem right here in the end. And then I can go ahead and just take that field and put that in right here. And so then when we make this call to the super constructor, passing in this apothem that we got as one of the fields here, that's going to come over to the super constructor. We're going to call this constructor. We're going to pass in the apothem that we just got from this call here, and we're going to use that to assign a value to our apothem field. Okay, so if we do this, we need to come back over to our constructor for our rectangle, and in addition to these two parameters I've given right here, we're going to need a third parameter. For this one, we're going to go ahead and do the 7.8 divided by 2, which we saw previously was 3.9. Go ahead and add that in as a third parameter. If we do that, we can also remove this since we're already going to set the apothem. We'll go ahead and save that. And now we'll go ahead and recompile this and see what happens now. So go ahead and compile it. And now we can actually compile it without any errors because of that call to the super constructor. So then we can go ahead and run it. And now we can still get all of the code that we had before, all the print statements. All right. So this is what happens whenever we use the super keyword inside of our constructors. So the last thing I want to go ahead and kind of wrap up on is to also make sure that we understand a couple of the rules regarding the use of the super keyword. So I've kind of noted the distinction between being able to use the default constructor versus our own custom constructor. As we can see right here, we've had to include this explicit call to super because of the fact that we introduced a constructor instead of our shape class. If I didn't include this constructor here and instead just had no constructor, then we could just call the default constructor, which would be this without any arguments. Additionally, we can exclude this line if we don't give our shape its own explicit constructor, because the Java will implicitly call the superconstructor on the default constructor if that is applicable. But of course, in this case now, because we introduced a constructor, we have to go ahead and include an explicit call to super and pass in the appropriate parameters for it. Additionally, just like with using the this call to our constructor in the same class, we have to make sure that this call to super is the very first thing. So it's got to be the first line that we include inside of our constructors. So the order that I have these in right now is exactly the order that we're going to need to have them in. If I were to move the super to one of these other lines inside of this rectangle constructor, then this will end up causing an error, so we won't be doing that. Additionally, we can also do one last thing, which is to include a couple more print statements right here, just to be able to demonstrate the ordering these things are being, each one of these constructors are being called in. So right here, I'm going to include a print statement right after my call to super and say you are in the rectangles constructor. Go ahead and save that. And then over here, the very first line I'll include in this is a print statement saying you are in the shapes constructor. Go ahead and save that. And then back over here at the demo, we've got a call to the rectangles constructor right here. So we're going to expect to see two things being printed to the console because of this, one about the shape and then one about the rectangle. And we also have this call to the shape constructor here. So you can expect a third additional print statement, again for the shape constructor. So we'll go ahead and make sure everything's saved. Come over here, we'll compile this. And then we'll run it. And now we can see these three additional statements that I've included. So we can see you're in the shapes constructor, then you are in the rectangles constructor, and then you are in the shapes constructor. So because of the fact that this call to super has to be the very first line, this also lets us know that we're going to end up calling the superclass, fully going through the code in the superclass's constructor before we actually finish going through the code for our current or our subclass's constructor. Okay, so this is going to wrap up everything for the super keyword. Going into the next video, I want to expand on this idea of inheritance by introducing what I would refer to as a hierarchy of inheritance, or a hierarchy of classes, where we're going to start looking at using more than just two classes with this inheritance relationship between them.